and with all the changes in the international system, world order, events and happenings in Asia, it was very difficult really to cope with the diversity. And so most of the discursive positions adopted two frameworks. One was that of the Great Game, the face-off between Russia and Britain in the late 19th century over Afghanistan, southern Central Asia. And so if there was, say, in the present context, a conflict over energy interests of access to energy resources, it was framed as the Great Game. The other framework was that of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road, of course, was this network of trade routes that existed from the 2nd century BC to the 15th century AD, and which had connected China right across the continent to West Asia, Africa, Europe. And we saw that right in the beginning of this century, there were many versions of the new Silk Road that were proposed. USA was very much there with its proposal, Hillary Clinton in Chennai, we all remember that. And the Central Asian countries also had their proposals for the new Silk Roads. And of course, China. To China goes the credit of coming up with the grandest vision of interconnectivity, of connecting not just the Asian continent, but beyond into Africa and Europe and even beyond that. And it was also the only country that had the finances to make this vision a reality. So the OBOR and then later on the BRI, all this in a sense is a revival of the old framework of the Silk Road. The third factor that I would outline here is Russia realizing that it would never really be admitted into the club of the Western powers and its pivot to Asia. So there have been several pivots to Asia in this century. And Russia growing very close to China. We heard of the unlimited friendship in in the morning session. And also China solving its border disputes. Now, yesterday in the last session, there was a reference to the fixation of and the fixation with borders that China has. And one of the main irritants during the time of the Soviet Union, existence of the Soviet Union, was the border issue. And we remember the Damansky incident in the 60s, which nearly blew up into a major war. So border issues between Central Asia and China, Russia and China, all was sorted out. And this made access across the continent much more easy. The fourth point that I would like to make is that Asia also has very many associations between countries which on the one hand cooperate and on the other hand contain each other. And this is, so it's a very multi-directional, fluid and zigzag, crisscross kind of situation that we have in Asia in terms of relationships between countries. As an example, I would say that if there is RIC, the RIC trilateral, Russia, India, China, then BRICS, then SCO, which had its summit recently in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. There is also Quad. There is also the shift from Asia-Pacific into the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific. So there are all kinds of alliances which don't really deter in any way another alliance with the same set of countries. Apart from that, along with the BRI, there is the INSTC. So it's not just an east-west movement that we're seeing, but also north-south. And as I said, pretty much crisscross. There's India's Look East policy, there's Sagar, which was referred to earlier, there's the cotton route, there is Mosam, there's so many things. There's so many other, the INSTC particularly linking India, Iran, Russia, and then Europe. So it's north-south, it's all over. So this diversity, I would say, is what characterizes Asia. And the fifth point, of course, is climate change, which is playing its own geopolitical, geostrategic role in the sense of if the Arctic really defreezes and the waters become navigable again, that is going to be another region that will come up within Asia, which would be of interest. So in terms of regional policy, regional region formations, regional blocks, Asia is a very interesting place to really be in. And we have a very, very interesting panel today. The first paper will deal with China, the BRI, and MENA, or as we also call it, WANA, West Asia, North Africa. And there's another paper on the concept of the Indo-Pacific and China's relationship with that. And the third paper, which will look at China and its relationship with the East Asian countries. So with these few words, I would request Professor Ümit Alperen to make his presentation.
Good afternoon. Also thanks ICS, CAS, and Goa University for this organization. Actually, I would like to talk on Chinese Middle East policy and geopolitical interests and ideological interests. As you know, Chinese fast-growing influence started with the economic engagements such as trade and investment. Investment in the Middle East. But this influence, this economic influence, also started to spread to the political and military field as well. However, it is difficult to say that China is challenging directly and comprehensively to the US in a geography dominated by political, economic, military, and religious, also ethnic turmoil such as the Middle East. As a global power, China's challenge to the US in the Middle East means a huge economic cost and also to be part of chronic problems in the Middle East. So we can say that China prefers to be a free-riding actor in the Middle East instead of contributing to the global governance equivalent to its global size. As you know, China calls itself as a responsible great power. What's the responsibility? Chinese Middle East policy has been reshaping by China's changing foreign policy, especially since 2013, with Xi and his historic initiative, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and also tensions in China-US relations. In this context, China's Middle East policy could be identified by a few factors. Firstly, China takes into account intra-regional balance between Israel, Iran, and Arabs, but without being a part of the chronic problems in the Middle East. For example, China has a discourse on the most chronic problems in the Middle East, Palestine-Israel issue. But so far, we cannot see that China has taken a serious initiative in the solution of the problem. This also works for China approach to Iran nuclear problem or nuclear issue. While China criticized the economic and political sanctions against Iran, it also votes in favor of the section in the United Nations Security Council. Why? China doesn't want to confront the USA for Iran, but would like to benefit it as a balancing instrument factor. Also, China prefer to use this kind of chronic problems in the Middle East as a leverage, especially during the difficult times in its relation with the US, especially when the Taiwan problem between the China and the US. Usually, we can see some increasing promoting the China-Iran relations. And also, China has been making the Middle East policy according to mainly Iran, Arab, and Israel balance of power. For example, last year, it was discussed in almost all the world media. China would invest 400 million USD in Iran in 25 years. According to they signed a comprehensive a framework agreement. It's possible, but the question is, can China make such a devastating investment that could break the balance of power between Arab, Iran, and Israel in the region? As you know, all of these countries, all of the Iran, Arabs, and Israel, they are usually in the Middle East, they rival each other. China-Middle East relation in last 2 decades show us that Chinese decision makers pay attention to the disbalance in the Middle East. Chinese policymakers are still coldly approaching game-changing strategies in the Middle East. While this fragile and sensitive balance makes China more attractive in the region, China also benefits from this fragility, from this status quo. Before the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, Chinese Middle East policy was shaped by economic interests, in particular Chinese energy security, energy supply. However, with the transformation of Chinese economic base foreign policy, but political motivated, into a comprehensive foreign policy since 2013, or in Chinese from Young-Hee to Youi, China started to become much more visible in political and military issues in the Middle East. Finance, 5G technology, arms sales, or joint arms production agreement between China and United Arab Emirates are example of this. Also, as you will remember, last summer, the UAE, which is highly dependent on the USA, especially in the field of security, had a tense process with the US due to China because of the joint arms production, also Chinese arms sales to United Arab Emirates. Also, naval agreements between the Oman and China recently also interesting development in the region, and also is the Chinese military promoting also this the military relation with the Middle East countries. Especially the financial agreements between the China and Gulf countries are noteworthy. As it is known, the world's largest wealth funds are in the Gulf region, $1 billion. In this way, China would like to consolidate its financial security with bilateral agreement in addition to institutional structures such as Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Although the importance of the Middle East increasing in Chinese foreign policy, it is not yet a priority region for Beijing. In Chinese foreign policy, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the great powers take priority over the Middle East. Particularly, the US focus on the AUKUS and Quad as an outcome of the pivot to Asia strategy and Indo-Pacific strategy. Also, and withdrawal of NATO forces from the Afghanistan directed China to prioritize its own periphery instead of the far geographies. For the first time since 1949, China has been pursuing threats from multiple fronts, from east to west, also west to south, from traditional to untraditional threat perception is the highest level for China. During the Cold War, China the US was the enemy of China or Soviet Union, not both of them at the same time. I think it would be useful to look at security and national security focus that was raised in Xi Jinping's speech at the CPC 20 Congress from this perspective. On the other hand, China is trying to fill the military, political, and economic gaps in the region with the growing global regional uncertainty and decline of the US influence in the Middle East. With the political motivation, carefully, step by step, without making any commitments to the regional actors, thus while China fills the gaps vacated by its global strategic rival, USA. On the other hand, hit two birds with one stone by elevating its relations with the allies of the USA in the Middle East, such as United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, also Turkey, with cautious diplomacy. On the other hand, Middle Eastern countries also follow a hedging strategy, both at regional and global level, while the balance of power is shifting in the global system. Balance of power in the Middle East also shifting. These middle-sized power or small-sized powers of the Middle East believe that they can protect and promote their national interests as much as they can establish good relations with non-regional great powers. In this way, they would like to diversify and balance their foreign policy and reduce dependency on the USA and Western actors, as well as uncertainties and unpredictabilities. In this context, China is an attractive actor for the Middle Eastern country with its investments, markets, and economic capacity without intervening their internal affairs. Middle Eastern countries also want to balance relation between China and the US. Also, the Middle Eastern countries don't want to lose China to their rivals. It works for all countries in the Middle East. Also Israel, also Iran, also Arab countries. Also, in Chinese foreign policy towards the Middle Eastern has a discourse. China emphasizes national sovereignty, win-win, and non-interference in internal affairs. In this approach, Beijing emphasizes the West is Western powers. It's colonial, exploit the region, while it's based on a win-win strategy based on the mutual respect for national security, national sovereignty, and internal affairs, presented as an alternative model to the US-led Western approach. This approach also can make it easier for China to deal with the elite authoritarian regimes of the Middle East. Actually, this is a contrast effect. I am good because you are worse than me. For China, also this works. China is good because Western powers worse than China in the Middle East or other part of the world. China also attaches importance to relations with the Middle Eastern countries and their support or impartiality regarding the criticism of the international community against Beijing for the human rights violation on the Uyghur Muslim minority since 2018. In addition to the Uyghur issue, China attached importance to the support of the Middle Eastern countries on Taiwan issue and the One China policies. Also, this also shows us that China is seeking a legitimization on Taiwan and Uyghur issue. Also need the Middle Eastern countries. Particularly, China cares about getting the support of the Muslim countries on the issue of the Uyghurs. China would like to say that Uyghur rights violation, human rights accusation are fabrication, Western fabrication against China. In fact, both on the issue of Uyghur human rights and the Taiwan issue, the Middle Eastern countries are in the position that China desires, especially in international platforms, just Only Turkey acts together with the Western democratic countries on the issue of Uyghur human rights. On the also 31 October, almost all of the Middle Eastern countries also supported the China on Uyghur issue. Also, why the Middle Eastern countries so positive to the China? The deterioration of relation between Middle Eastern countries with their traditional partner, Western countries, directed to them develop good relation and their silence towards human rights violation. But this is also a reality. Further decline of the US influence in the region may force China in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you for keeping well within the time limit. I now request Professor Avinash Godbole to make his presentation.
Thank you. So let me start with a couple of confessions. I'm as sleepy as all of you are. Football, protest in China, grading and presentation kept me up. So yeah, that is the first explanation. So if I make mistakes, it's not my mistakes. Second, it's daunting to speak on IR in front of our teachers, Professor Sani and Alka Acharya. I must acknowledge you started teaching us IR, so I'm still scared to speak in front of you. And third, I didn't know how to start the presentation, but Tuvia helped yesterday. So let me start. The world today is undergoing profound challenges, unseen in a century with complex and severe contradictions. Right, so I'm going to contradict with a couple of presentations that happened before, and the general theme. I don't think that the new era has started with this party congress. I have been thinking that the new era actually began in 2008 after the global financial crisis. What Xi Jinping has been doing is in many ways continuation of Hu Jintao's work, who doesn't get a lot of credit. The mission to create blue water navies goes to Hu Jintao. The mission to resolve the energy crisis and the Malacca dilemma is Hu Jintao's doing. So is the outward movement of taking and bringing the Chinese influence. That sense of triumph that China had continued when Xi Jinping came into power, and he kind of had got that mandate to continue this forward. So China's Asia strategy actually is in the sense that sort of continuation there. In my opinion, what we are seeing now is China's realization that the world does not acknowledge China's power. It does not recognize it. There's no sense of reciprocity, or the world doesn't recognize Chinese power either in a material way or in a normative way, given how we all have responded to BRI. And that is what is new in the present era of Xi Jinping, especially in the third term and onwards. So more forceful way and more clearer and more repeated enunciations of the policy will be there. The second point from theoretical perspective is China's foreign policy centered around the individual, or is it a response to the structure? And my opinion is that, especially on the point that I'm talking, China's response to Indo-Pacific, it is very much a response to the structure, the anarchy and everything else that is there, the recognition of power and protection of core interests. So these are the backgrounds to my idea around which I have developed this paper. There are two parts of my presentation. First is what is Chinese response to the concept of Indo-Pacific, and second, why. And that why part is actually a work in progress. It can be added and expanded eventually as I write the paper. So let me get into this. So there are two subparts of the is the Chinese response to the idea of Indo-Pacific. The first is political. And we have seen the dismissive answers to that from Wang-Yi, a club of small countries with vested interest. He said that in May this year, kind of a bitter and dismissive response to Indo-Pacific. And quite interestingly, Xi Jinping just about a month ago chose the APEC CEO summit to respond to Indo-Pacific while not talking about it. He kept talking of Asia-Pacific, that Asia-Pacific is a construct that should not be destroyed. Asia-Pacific is no one's backyard and shouldn't become an arena for big power contest. I'm quoting from his speech. No attempt to wage a new Cold War will ever be allowed by the people at this time in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm still curious why he chose this CEO's forum to respond to this notion. He said, what is the way forward for the countries and everyone in Asia-Pacific? Obviously here you see a clearer response to Indo-Pacific. Bolster the foundations of peaceful development. Again, one of the core interest statement. Take a people-centered approach. Again, a very veiled criticism that this is not that what the Indo-Pacific is not a people-centered approach. It's a military-centered approach, or it's a power-centered approach that others are taking. Pursue a higher level of opening up and pursue better integration in Asia-Pacific as a response to deglobalization that we see everywhere. Fourth, strive for high standards of connectivity in Asia. Again, something that was as a response to deglobalization and slow progress on the BRI. Fifth, build stable and uninterruptible industrial and supply chains, obviously self-explanatory, and promote economic upgradation. The second is economic response to Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific Economic Initiative was criticized in equally strong terms that it is, again, a vested interest-driven policy. The second response in economic terms is repeated use of the vocabulary of community of shared destiny in various forums. A renewed sense of bargaining at the BRI forums, more kind of listening in the latter parts of the BRI summits rather than telling what is good for you, as Jabin also mentioned. Moderated plans in BRI and RCEP as a common platform, and UN-led, certainly talking of UN-led initiatives and so on. So these are two ways in which China is responding, politically and economically. Militarily, not yet, but we'll see what happens, and I have also put a question on that later. What are the sources? The three reasons, the three sources of why China is responding in this way to the Indo-Pacific concept. The idea of core interest, and that idea of core interest was also displayed in the Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy. There's a long kind of statement came out earlier this year on Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy, updated one, and it has a kind of response to Indo-Pacific within that as well. The correct guidance of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era is the way forward for party, armed forces, and the Chinese people. Because certain countries have strategic goal of containing China within its neighborhood, within its periphery as such. They have processed to initiate a new Cold War, and they work with the new Cold War mentality and ideological bias that is directly aimed against China. They are also working on a disinformation campaign in order to smear and attack China and contain China. And these countries are putting together various gatherings and small forums to embolden themselves and seek selfish gains, so non-cooperative in a way. And they have created blocks by ganging up in smaller circles. Again, specific attack on the idea of Indo-Pacific. And to sabotage security and stability of China's periphery and undermine China's core interest. So again, core interest becomes the principal issue. Second response came from Young-Hee in his speech in detail, where he also said that Indo-Pacific is antithetical to the existing cooperation in Asia, but specifically he mentioned that Indo-Pacific is going to break down ASEAN centrality eventually, something that on which ASEAN also had doubt until I think 3 weeks ago when Vice President visited and India and ASEAN upgraded the relations to comprehensive strategic partnership, where ASEAN centrality finds mention again above ASEAN's appreciation of India's Indo-Pacific approach. So that is also a document worth looking at. So this Young-Hee statement came much before this India-ASEAN summit. Forcing smaller Asian countries to take sides, disrupting economic harmony in the region, and so on, and end the win-win cooperation. So that is the core interest and driven criticism of Indo-Pacific. The second is China as a norm maker, and China has long wished to be a norm maker in the world, and it begins in Asia as such. I noticed it first at the SICA summit in 2014. China was hosting that summit, and Xi Jinping said that Asian countries should solve their problems among themselves, not wait or depend on outside powers to come and help them solve their problems. So Asia for Asians kind of vocabulary, I think there was a lot of alarm response at that point of time, and that point was not repeated later. Second, the work forum on neighborhood diplomacy. Again, there was a point on telling the China story to the developing world and developing partnerships. The central work on work relating to foreign affairs immediately after that. There, the vocabulary of new kind of major country relations, community of shared destiny, and again, Indo-Pacific does contradict these ideas at theoretical level. The third, what are the domestic sources of China's foreign policy? And again, I'll confess that this is not a fully developed point in my paper at this point, but at home it becomes easy to sell the narrative that China's responses are aimed at containing or responding to the provocations created by others. So China is not a problem, others are the problem, and that's why our foreign policy is a good foreign policy as a response to everyone else. So that sells at home very well. But Hong-Hee Lai's book on domestic sources of China's foreign policy, regimes, leaderships, priorities, and processes. Again, self-explanatory, I'll not get into details. Regimes, domestic politics, leaderships, visions, processes, and priorities, the institution's interests, and so on and so forth. What comes next? Why will China continue to criticize the Indo-Pacific idea? Again, the point of narrative. Sorry, Professor Gudrun, I'm going to bring your presentation again into my highlight, but because I agree with it completely. And again, this idea of whole process democracy is a point to undermine the other democracies. That the superiority of the Chinese system is projected through the reiteration of the notion of whole process democracy. And I quote from the Party Congress report, that it is a democracy in its most broadest, most genuine, and most effective form. I think this form of China model narrative is here to stay, and we have discussed that already. Again, so Indo-Pacific will challenge this China model narrative and China's peaceful role in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific kind of narrative in the days to come as well. My second last point is how it might reflect in China's behavior in real terms, in military terms. Again, that's an open-ended question. Does China act aggressive when it is at its point of strength, or when it's feeling threatened, or it's at a point of weakness? And it will depend on how we all analyze something as recent as the Galwan crisis, right? What was the Chinese motive and the Chinese narrative in that? Again, I have not answered this question here, but I will eventually include this in responding how China's response to Indo-Pacific in military terms might shape the strength or weakness perspective. And lastly, since I have worked in think tanks, what are the implications for India, right, in India's foreign policy and Indo-Pacific as such? There's a distinction between India's approach to Indo-Pacific and the American approach, clearly. India is still the only country that uses the term inclusive in its statements, like free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, right? The rest of the countries don't use that. So is there a way to, no, right, you don't. Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, that's, I mean, from what I have seen the previous statements, comparisons, that trend continues even recently. So will we have to take a kind of different approach because of our own problems with China and our own approach to Indo-Pacific? I'll end on this point. I didn't start my presentation by thanking, but thank you, Alka ma'am, ICS, and everyone else. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Godbole. And I now invite Professor Chang, Young-Hee, to make his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I think it would be rare for a Korean researcher to come to India and share opinions on China issue. I guess it will be the first time that a Korean researcher attends the IFC. Anyway, I'm very honored to come to India after a 15-hour flight to meet India's leading Chinese experts and to hear India's perspective and insight. The 20th Party Congress was a venue for Xi Jinping to confirm long-term power like an emperor. Several analysts are paying attention to Xi Jinping's long-term reign and concentration of power. However, I think we need to look at the plight of the CCP and the logic behind it, which had no choice but to condone Xi Jinping's long-term rule and concentration of power. Only by understanding this, we'll be able to better understand the challenges facing the CCP and better see the future. Xi Jinping's political report to the 20th Party Congress, unlike the 18th and 19th reports, mentioned national security, 国家安全 29 times, and various safety issues such as the economy and supply chain and food 91 times. Under the structure of US-China strategic competition, security concerns in various areas recognized by the CCP leadership have increased. The 20th Party Congress did not directly mention United States anywhere, but it's describing things that criticize American behavior. For example, hegemonism, power politics, Cold War thinking, domestic interference, double standards, etc. In his political report, Xi Jinping mentioned the word struggle, 奋斗, 28 times, and expressed his strong will to increase defense capabilities. He expressed his intention to maintain a strong position in foreign policy, including relations with the United States. These rhetorics do not indicate that China is taking a hardline position because it has strong capacity or because it has enough confidence in the current situation. Instead, it is apparent that China is experiencing a deep sense of crisis and fear. The CCP and Xi Jinping's most fundamental fear stems from the risk of losing power and one-party system collapse under Xi Jinping. The 20th Party Congress promoted hardliners in the diplomatic field. Xi Jinping's third-term foreign policy team includes Wang Yi, Qin Chinese ambassador to the United States, Liu Jianchao, director of external liaison department of the CPC, and Liu Haixing, deputy director of National Security Commission. They became members of the Central Committee. At this party congress, CCP has strengthened the politics of identity, which will widen the distance of values with East Asian democracies and reduce the space for cooperation. Due to China's socialist system becoming a softened North Korea, South Koreans are distanced from China, and their strategic communication is weakening in Korean society. Moreover, a conservative government with a pro-American stance is in power. As a result, there is growing mistrust between Korea and China in each other's policies. Economically, Korea has a trade structure centered on exporting intermediate goods to China. However, as China's industrial and technological independence has accelerated, the space for economic cooperation between Korea and China has also narrowed. Under the influence of a strategic competition between the United States and China, North Korea and China are more likely to strengthen strategic cooperation. Therefore, even if North Korea conducts a nuclear test, the nuclear test will not adversely affect North Korea-China relations. Meanwhile, China will try to avoid the US brunt by convincing or persuading its neighbors and developing countries. However, if neighboring countries choose to bandwagon to the US or distance themselves from China, they may try to control the situation through economic retaliation. I'd like to talk about China's strategy on the Korean Peninsula during Xi Jinping's third term. The Korean Peninsula has grown in geopolitical value as a buffer zone for US-China forces. This is because the Korean Peninsula provides an effective foundation for forming a Chinese-led peripheral order. The Korean Peninsula plays an imperative role in China's relationship with the United States and Japan. China will strive to curb the US-led formation of order on the Korean Peninsula and seek to expand its influence in favor of forming a domestic-led order. China will strengthen North Korea-China relations while attaching importance to North Korea's strategic values in order to form a regional order centered on its own. In addition, we will deter strengthening of Korea-US alliance. It will deter the strengthening of the Korea and US alliance and Korea-US-Japan security cooperation and seek to weaken the US blockade of China through incentives for cooperation between Korea and China. This trend is acting as a driving force for the improvement of North Korea-China relations in the context of the US-China competition, which is expected to continue in the third term of Xi Jinping. Therefore, North Korea-China relations will be further consolidated in the future. Nevertheless, North Korea-China relations are limited because it is the United States that can ultimately resolve the North Korean problem, which North Korea wants. For example, the lifting of economic sanctions, the resolution of hostile policies toward North Korea, and regime security. Finally, I would like to give my opinion on the cross-strait relationship. In the process of justifying Xi Jinping's third term, he redefined that political integration with Taiwan is more than just resolving cross-strait relations. As part of China's national development strategy, he argues that unification with Taiwan is crucial for the revival of the Chinese nation and the achievement of the second century's goal. In addition, the Taiwan issue was defined as a key agenda in the US-China competition and as a core interest directly related to China's sovereignty, security, and development. Xi Jinping stated at the party congress that he would strive for peaceful unification with utmost sincerity and effort, which indirectly reflected his assessment of the current state. This implied that there was too much uncertainty about an armed invasion against Taiwan based on US intervention. Therefore, strategic patience was still needed at the time, but other means were also utilized, such as gray zone tactics, something like that. So, I note that China's criticism on the Taiwan issue is limited to interference from outside forces, and very few Taiwan's independent forces, 极少数台独分子，极少数. It shows that the Chinese Communist Party is adopting a method of discriminatory treatment and targeted attacks in terms of the tactics of the United Front or divide and rule. The problem is the structure of public opinion in Taiwan. According to the survey of National Chengchi University's research team, at least 30% of Taiwan's public opinion basically aims for independence. It cannot be 极少数. Therefore, the expression of a small minority of Taiwanese independence forces is China's wishful thinking. And if China is truly solve the Taiwan issue, it must eventually recognize the Democratic Progressive Party as a counterpart. The refusal to recognize the DPP as a counterpart in the negotiations can only be interpreted as that Xi Jinping lacks sincerity for cross-strait unification and is rather using Taiwan to secure his own ruling legitimacy through cross-strait tensions. Although China emphasizes the one country, two systems concept as a discourse for unification, the hardline suppression of Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests in 2019 has greatly undermined its credibility. Therefore, it can be said that CCP's initiatives related to Taiwan at the 20th Party Congress are very insufficient discourse to solve the problem. I'll stop here because of time limit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang, Young-Hee. I now request Jyoti Malhotra to lead the discussion on these three papers.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to join my voice to all those before me in thanking the Institute of Chinese Studies, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the University of Goa for this wonderful opportunity to meet so many China scholars in one room over the last 48 hours. It's been fascinating, but also exhausting. So as a journalist, I asked myself, what the headline of this conference is. You know, we are used to writing 500 words or maximum 600 or 700 words, and you guys write sort of like big papers. So what's the headline of this conference? The second is, the second point that I asked myself, or the second question I asked myself is, what are we doing here in Goa? I mean, you know, Goa is this beautiful little city, town, state on the Arabian Sea, not far from Sri Lanka, where a Chinese research vessel, not so long ago, only in August, the Yuan 5, docked in the Hambantota port. And just weeks after, the Sri Lankans had promised India that they would not allow this Chinese vessel to come to Sri Lanka. So what does this incident tell us, and what are the lessons that we learn from it? What indeed is the impact of China's foreign policy in Xi Jinping's 10th year in power on all of South Asia? And the third point that I'd like all my panelists to talk about perhaps a little bit more is, where do we go from here? I mean, I know that you know, Avinash, you sort of had this reference to the Galwan confrontation earlier. Over the last couple of days, we've also sort of very peripherally talked about India and China. But if we're talking regional policy, then perhaps India and China being the two big, you know, countries in the region and in this part of the world, I think perhaps we can talk about this a little bit more, if that's okay with the organizers. But just to come back to South Asia and China's influence on South Asian media, and as a journalist, I was wondering if I could share a few thoughts on that. Nepal, for example. I've just come back from Nepal, and it's so interesting to see the manner in which the Chinese government has expanded influence. All of you know how it's expanded influence in Nepal. Nepal's turned to the north especially after the blockade of 2015, when the Nepali political parties accused India of supporting the blockade in the Madhes, in the Terai. KP Oli was then prime minister, turned northwards. I mean, obviously he used that as an excuse to turn northwards. Subsequently, the dispute in the triangular region between Limpiadhura, Lipu Lake, and Kalapani. Then what happens? The Chinese expand influence in the Nepali media. Not just in the English language media, but in the Nepali media. Not just in the Pahad, but in the Terai. And today you see journalists from Nepal visiting China under the aegis of, you know, whatever these associations are, these media friendship associations, traveling not just to Beijing and Shanghai, but to Chengdu, even to Tibet. And that's when, you know, the penny drops, because Nepal has already disallowed Tibetans from coming into Nepal and then onwards into India to Dharamshala, because that's where they all want to go and meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And this border, and actually there's not just this one border in Tatopani, there are several border points between Nepal and China, or Nepal and Tibet. So the Nepali-Chinese relationship is fascinating. And elections have just been held in Nepal just a week or so ago. Results will be out on the 8th of December. And we will see what happens in these elections. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that it was the Chinese Communist Party's leadership and its representatives who came into Nepal and who basically brought the various factions of the communist parties in Nepal and merged them in 2018. After the last elections, which were fought by the previous Prime Minister KP Oli on an anti-India platform. So everywhere you go in South Asia, you know, India and China rubbing up against each other. Pakistan is a classic example. And again, every Prime Minister of Pakistan, when they go to Beijing or when a Chinese leader comes to Islamabad, their first public statement is that our relationship is higher than the mountains, deeper than seas, and sweeter than honey, or you can sort of, many alternatives to honey, perhaps not so sweet. The influence in the Pakistani media, the Chinese influence in the Pakistani media, enormous. Very little criticism of China in the Pakistani media. CPEC now, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, I think someone said this morning that it's not, that there are now voices coming up against CPEC, and that is already happening. In Punjabi, so I'm Punjabi, and you know, journalists no longer get a visa to go to Pakistan. But if you talk to people in Pakistani Punjab, in Punjabi, and they will tell you how irritated they are with the Chinese. They will not say this in Urdu, they will not say this in Hindustani, certainly not in English, but in local Punjabi, they will tell you how angry they are with the Chinese because they just, basically, they sort of take over the land. Well, they take over and the government's given them the land. It's not like they're taking it over. And how they have expanded influence. And I think that's a real loss on India's part because we don't have an India-Pakistan relationship or nothing, you know, not much one anyway. So yeah, essentially, I think India's ceding ground in Pakistan to China. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, the influence of the Chinese in Sri Lanka, we saw how Ranil Wickremesinghe was forced, you know, not just to have the ship come in. And I think there was legitimate frustration in Delhi when the ship was allowed to dock because India had really gone out of its way to help Sri Lanka during its economic crisis over the last several months, over the last year. You know, India is not a rich country by any stretch of the imagination, so sending sort of food aid, medicines, you know, oil to Sri Lanka, and then you have Ranil give way to the Chinese. But who's in the background? You have Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is in debt to the Chinese. So perhaps that's not as surprising. I am not going to talk about Galwan because, but I'm hoping that the panelists here will talk about Galwan. But the question is, why is why is the leadership in Beijing, why does it have this aggressive sort of disposition towards its neighbors? I mean, you can argue, like Isaac Carden argued yesterday, that it was India's building of its infrastructure in the border area, especially in Ladakh, that pushed the Chinese into this aggressive action, that too during COVID. But the question is that even if the Chinese believe that that they are the ones who, you know, that they are not occupying somebody else's territory, India, of course, believes it's an occupation of Indian territory. But why is it that the Chinese do not want to engage in conversation with the other disputed party, which is India in this particular case? Why is it that they've never exchanged maps, especially across the three sectors of this long boundary dispute? So if you can explain what this is about. Is it about putting India down, another large country with a rising population, as Herbert said this morning, that he talked about the demographics? Is it that, you know, India needs to be put in its place, the only other civilizational power, certainly in this part of the world? What is it? So perhaps if each of you could answer that question. But I was, you know, just to come back to each of your presentations, Umar, I was very fascinated by your bringing together the China's relationship with the Arab world, especially because around Islam, the Islamic states of the Arab world. But Tuvia yesterday brought to my notice that China has been invited to Saudi Arabia. There's likely to be a summit in a few days from now. Now it's not some little Emirati republic. This is the holy custodian of the two mosques. So how does Saudi Arabia deal with this large country, you know, coming into Riyadh, not far from Makkah, Medina? He's a card-carrying atheist. What does this do to the Islamic world, to the Arab world? If you can talk a little bit more about that. Avinash, you know, I think your comments about the free, open, and inclusive, I mean, I know you said that about the Americans, but isn't there some sort of a difference in understanding of this phrase, the Indo-Pacific, between, say, the Americans and Russia? And do you think that the Indians are caught in the middle? And this morning I saw India's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, speaking to journalists. He was at a Times Now interaction where he said that the Quad members do not understand or they don't have the same respect that we have about India's sort of borders, for example, maps. And I mean, even if his comment is not germane to the issue, but say a country like Australia, very, very, very close relationship with the Chinese, now very much part of the Quad. What does this do to the China-Australia relationship? As for the headline, I'll tell you later, the headline from this conference.
So, maybe you could start by, if you would like to reply to some of the questions raised. Dr. Ümit.
Thank you. First of all, United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, it doesn't matter. They don't have any influence on Turkey. I am from Turkey because of that. But they have some influence. This is all reality. But Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, their relation also with the China is totally based on the rationality, just based on their national interest. As you know, in 2017, I think, they firstly, after Jamal Khashoggi, journalist Jamal Khashoggi, murdered in Saudi Arabia consulate in Istanbul, then Mohammed bin Salman was excluded from the Western world. Then he visited China and he said, okay, we are supporting the Chinese ethnic policies. It means the Uyghur policies, actually. Also, the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, almost all of the Arab countries, oil-rich Arab countries, has some 2030 projects. And also, this the Chinese investment in the Middle East, the Gulf countries, also the Saudi Arabia, overlapping with Chinese investment project and this country's future project. So how can they attract much more the investment? Or not the Western countries, not the other countries, only they have China, but there is also a reality. They can deal easily with China because China also doesn't have so much the influence on this country, especially in cultural power. Just on the as an economic power, also this is a good opportunity for the Gulf countries and Middle East countries, not more than this one. Actually, there's a real issue. They would like to balance the U.S. in the Middle East, and because the U.S. is declining of the U.S. influence in the Middle East, this is a big problem for the new balance of power in the Middle East. The second, also they are balancing to each other. For example, okay, we are talking mostly is the Israel, Arabs, and the Iran's balance, but also there are also the balances, for example, in the Gulf countries. The Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also is competing with each other.
Well, I have not seen Mr. Jaishankar's statement, so I don't know how to respond to that. But on why is China aggressive towards its neighborhood and why it chose India, again, that's a normative conflict between India and China on the Asian values, the Asian narrative. As a large developing country, something that can succeed. I mean, we have seen Chinese scholars come to India. I've seen this right from my first job, that Chinese scholars have come to India and have said this, that what's the value of your democracy if your people are still hungry? And I mean, that I have listened to this sentence 15 years ago, but it stuck with me. So that's the way they're going to challenge India as a system, that to put India down in the community of nations. India as the only major power that can challenge the overall China narrative as a peacefully rising country in a single party, that China as a single party, as a successful single party post-colonial country versus a struggling democracy. And it's also a message to other countries. Other than India, all the contesting powers with China either have they settled their borders directly or are in the alliances with the US. That's why, I mean, they would have chosen India as an example in that Galwan crisis situation, that if we can teach a lesson to India, then it's a lesson for everyone else in the neighborhood on how to handle China and or how to respect China or that sort of thing. But yeah, that's my short answer to this.
Ms. Jyoti raised some fundamental questions, I think. Where do China's problems and insecurity originate from under the guise of strongmen and violence? First of all, there are some problems with the Communist Party's one-party system itself, and another is because the United States is pressing for its hegemonic supremacy. What we need to note is that China has a lot of problems, but sometimes the US over pressure to China to maintain its hegemony, it's hurting the economy and security of neighboring countries. I'd like to make a further comment on the issue of the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Strait is the most likely flashing point for a war between the US and China. But the problem is that the war in the Taiwan Strait is not a disaster only for Taiwan and China. It will bring a great disaster not only to Korean Peninsula, but also to neighboring countries and to all mankind. So we cannot leave this problem to the United States alone. Just as distrust of China is, our distrust of China is great, but we also cannot trust the United States fully. The way the US deals with the Taiwan issues represents US domestic politics, US geo-economic interests, and sometimes represents the interests of the military industrial complex. So I believe that third power, such as India, Europe, and East Asia, and the countries with pursuing peace and stability should continue to peace initiative in advance. Yeah. Yes.
I'd now open this up for a quick round of questions. The organizers have asked us to wind up the session as quickly as possible. So maybe we can do one round of all the questions that are there. So maybe I'll start from here.
Good afternoon, and yeah, my question is to the panel. In fact, because actually in the previous panel as well, like session on parties building narrative abroad, and now with this regional session and regional policy. So my question is vis-a-vis the institution of CITCA, China International Development Cooperation Agency. I think today, like it's a departure from Ministry of Commerce to Ministry of Foreign Affairs. actually shows an important departure. So I think in the previous session, and I think this session, I think Annie can respond from the panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's really interesting because we really had 3 different regions here featuring in the presentations. We had East Asia, we had the Middle East, and we had the Indo-Pacific. And then Jyoti very kindly brought South Asia into it. Now, if you have 4 regions there, what's the difference? I think the difference really, and I think we really need to resort to theory here a bit. The concept of the security complex, I think, is really important here, because 3 of these regions fall into China's security complex. The Indo-Pacific does, South Asia does, and self-evidently East Asia does. The Middle East does not. And so you will see behavior from Middle East states that you will not see from the states of these other 3 regions. So I think that's something that probably we need to keep in mind. And we still do not know how China's neighbors are eventually going to react to this very overt, aggressive behavior. I mean, in the South China Sea, for example, whatever you may say during the Duterte presidency, the fact of, that Chinese behavior on the long term and its impact on the Filipino population and the public, I think it's going to leave a huge mark out there. So this question about whether China's neighbors are ultimately going to balance China or bandwagon China, I think is still very much open today. Within ASEAN, you see both evidence of bandwagoning behavior. You look at Cambodia and you see balancing behavior. In fact, some would argue that the Singaporeans are doing a very sophisticated form of balancing. The Indonesians, certainly you could see their behavior and consider it to be balancing, perhaps the Malaysians as well. So in a period of strategic uncertainty, there is ultimately only one rational behavior, and that is hedging. You do not put all your eggs in one basket. And to some extent, everything that I've heard from this panel seems to suggest that that's basically a fairly simple kind of explanation. And then getting to Jyoti's question about, the third of the question she put the panel about what does it mean going ahead? I think the answer to that is to some extent going to be some of the things that we were discussing in previous sessions, which is what is happening within China, what is that going to do in terms of China's external projection? And because there are huge uncertainties there, to some extent, these uncertainties will remain. So you got on the one hand a global hegemon in relative decline. Nobody questions that. But it still isn't clear that there is anything remotely like a peer competitor to the United States. Remotely. And for every single fact that we get in about China, you can bring in 3 counterfacts to suggest that there's still a yawning gulf between this declining global hegemon and everybody else.
I have one question each. First question to Ümit. What do you think will be the China's reaction to I2U2? That is the question to you. And to Avinash, if at all, is there anything that will make China like IP, Indo-Pacific? Yeah. The third one to Chang. How do you see Japan-PRC relations panning out?
Yes, Professor Zhang mentioned about that report of the 20-Party Congress, and he emphasized that 奋斗, struggle, mentioned in 17 times in 20-Party Congress. But in Taiwan, we are not translated to 奋斗, we translated to 斗争. So the different meaning. 奋斗 is opposite meaning. 斗争is negative meaning. When communists say 斗争, it meaning maybe argue with you, maybe fighting with you, maybe breaking conflict and war with you, and maybe the so-called 文斗, information warfare to you. So I think this is different. And then Xi Jinping also mentioned about 敢于斗争, 勇于斗争, dare to fight, dare to struggle, and brave to struggle, brave to fight. And why Xi Jinping mentioned this? Because China right now, when Xi Jinping, the report, he said, right now China is facing very changeable situation for 100 years. It meaning China right now is facing difficult time. So dare to fight, brave to fight. Okay, we need to focus about this. And then you mentioned about that 少数台独. You cite the investigation of Zheng Da. Yes, I think not 30%, because right now independent maybe 10%, and maintain status quo and then independent maybe 20%. Maintain status quo forever maybe 30%. So more than 30%. Yeah, but right now in Taiwan, if you against, if you do not agree, one country, two system, maybe more than 80%. So it meaning Taidu maybe 80%, not very few independent. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I asked him about what will be China's reactions to the four-country grouping that is talked about, that is India, Israel, UAE, and US. I2U2 is what they call it.
Two quick comments. One to Varun. Varun, even if China, okay, he doesn't listen to me, so I will bring out my other comment. There is a study of the rhodium. There is a study of the rhodium group which hasn't been published yet, but they did calculations what a conflict over Taiwan would mean for the world economy. And their assumption is the simplest scenario. China blockades Taiwan and nobody responds. Taiwan doesn't do anything, the US doesn't do anything, Japan doesn't do anything. It's not a very likely scenario, but it's the simplest baseline they could find. And their calculation, the number is not so important, but it boils down to something like $1.5 trillion within 1 week. And then they break it down into different sectors because there are a lot of secondary implications of such a conflict where our infrastructure stops working and stuff like that. So this is a very rough calculation. They will write it up and it will be published at some point, but they shared it with the European Union. And I think this is also something for India to think about, what the implications of such a conflict would be. And my second remark was provoked by you. I mean, even if we are right, and whatever we think about China's domestic situation and whether they have peaked or not, the US is treating them like the only peer competitor. And this is the reality in which we live, right? So somehow, I wonder how relevant it is whether we predict the coming collapse of China or their demographic, in the year 5000, there will be no Chinese left. This is all a moot point now when we are living in a world that is structured, where international politics is structured by the strategic rivalry between the US and China.
Yes, China's reaction, maybe US, United Arab Emirates, India, and Israel. Actually, China has a special relationship with these countries bilaterally. The US, we know, India, okay, but Israel is okay. But since 2020, Israel and China relations keep in a silence. In a silence. Because of between the Israel and the US, also because of the China, they experience some problem, especially Haifa ports. Also some selling some weapon system, etc. etc. I think now the China-Israel relations a bit cold. Tuya is this is from Israel. He knows, of course, better than me. United Arab Emirates and China relations. This is totally based on the rationality. United Arab Emirates also is benefiting China. China also benefiting from United Arab Emirates from its potential. But this was a reality. Just last summer, United Arab Emirates also in a crisis with the US because of the China and purchasing some Chinese weapon system. Also, this joint weapons, joint production, joint weapon production, etc. So we should look at the results. What will happen? Really, this kind of meeting will be successful or not. Shanghai Cooperation Organization also is. It was dominated by the China and Russia, but now, like the enemies clubs or rival clubs, all of the Pakistan, India, India, China, and also so many countries also getting together. But what's the results?
Okay, Professor Sani, yeah, I like your point. Yeah, security complex is the reason, and hedging is what's going to continue. I mean, Malaysia one day will kind of criticize or not speak on Indo-Pacific, but next day you will see visuals of US pipelines taking off from the Malaysian military bases. So that's a clear hedging strategy. And yeah, I agree with you that that's going to be the way forward to minimize risk or to balancing risk between options. And I guess the smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN countries included, I don't think they will ever speak on Indo-Pacific openly, but outside the grouping and in bilateral meetings, they will agree that the development of concept like Indo-Pacific is a good thing. Even South Korea, for that matter, will not speak openly, I guess, pro-Indo-Pacific, at least for 5-7 years, until their dependence on China economically is going to be there. And I mean, using tourists as punishment for South Korea, how China did after the third incident and so on, that dependence. So even if these countries don't speak, they will continue to hedge and balance their risk. Yeah. On the question of General Narasimhan's on how will China like Indo-Pacific, I don't see any reason. I mean, eventually we might have a China Indo-Pacific code of conduct maybe, because we both talk at each other on common rules-based architecture. But if there's the code of conduct can only be on addressing the gaps or anything, but that's too far in the future, I think, as of now.
Thank you very much for Shen Suozang, Director Shen's comment. But my main argument is that why CCP didn't and doesn't acknowledge DPP represents the public opinion of Taiwan society. It's a fact. And according to the change of demographic change, the Taiwanese identity is growing more, become a majority. And now it's already majorities. amounts to 70%. And regarding Japan and South Korean relations, actually now South Korean government is belongs to conservative camps. Korean conservative political camps supports U.S., Japan, Korea cooperation, and sometimes allies. But they have no definite definite basis of public opinion, because Korean people's anti-Japan Japan sentiment is not so few. But we cannot make a war with with Japan. Don't worry. But this year, our new government comes to power, and then want join the Quad Plus. But Japan oppose. We cannot allow South Korea to join the Quad or Quad Plus. It means actually United States and Japan alliance, between United States and Japan alliance and United States and Korea alliance is a little different to come together. And this during these 5 years for our new conservative government, they will pursue the cooperation with Japan. But Japan's position is not so positive now. But they will have under American pressure to cooperate with South Korea.
So, thank you very much. I think the presentations were excellent. And thank you to the discussant too. Well, Asia, its diversity, the many regional powers, the bandwagoning and the balancing, as Professor Sani put it, the cooperation and containment, all this going on, making Asia a very, very happening place as far as not just China, but for all the various countries that go into making this great continent. So thank you to all the participants, and I think we can call this session to a close.
I thank the chair, Professor Doraiswamy, and the panel for gracing this forum with their experience and insights. This brings us to the end of session 6, titled Regional Policy, of the 5th India Forum on China at Goa. I now humbly request all the delegates to proceed for tea. We shall gather here again at 4:15 p.m. sharp for the concluding session of the 5th India Forum on China at Goa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.